Mrs. Hayes, I found something in the wedding photos that should never have been there. Come alone, and don't breathe a word to your daughter.
Eleanor Hayes stood frozen in her kitchen, the phone pressed against her ear. The voice belonged to Phoebe Carter, the wedding photographer, the woman who'd captured every smile, every toast, every carefully choreographed moment of Lydia's wedding 6 weeks ago. A day that had cost Eleanor $58,000. Her hand trembled as she lowered the coffee cup back to the counter. Through the window, morning light spilled across the wooden table where she'd eaten breakfast alone for 15 years. The house was quiet now, though that wouldn't last. Upstairs, her younger daughter Molly and that boyfriend of hers were still asleep. They'd been temporarily staying here for 3 years. But none of that mattered in this moment. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's voice came out thinner than she intended. "What's in the photos?" Phoebe's breath was audible on the line. Not quite a sigh, but close. "I can't explain this over the phone. You need to see it yourself. Can you come to my studio? This afternoon at 2? Eleanor glanced at the clock above the stove. It was 9:30. 4.5 hours to wait. 4.5 hours to imagine what could be so disturbing that a professional photographer would call with that tone in her voice. Is it about Lydia?" Eleanor heard herself ask. Another pause. Longer this time. "It involves her husband, Jake." The way Phoebe said his name, careful, almost apologetic, made Eleanor's stomach drop. Jake Porter. Charming Jake with his easy smile and smooth sales pitch about medical equipment. The man who'd swept Lydia off her feet 8 months ago and proposed 3 months after that. Eleanor had thought it was fast, but Lydia seemed happy. Wasn't that enough? "Mrs. Hayes, I need you to trust me. Come alone. Don't mention this to anyone. Not Lydia, not Molly, not anyone." Eleanor nodded, then realized Phoebe couldn't see her. "All right, 2 o'clock. After she hung up, Eleanor stood perfectly still in the middle of her kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled its final drops into the pot. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice, then stopped. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago. Except it wasn't. She'd lived in this house for 43 years, raised 2 daughters here, built a business from nothing while her husband managed the books. When he died, she kept going, sold the hardware store 5 years ago, and retired with enough to live comfortably. Not wealthy, but secure. Independent. That independence had felt like freedom once. Now it felt more like loneliness with a mortgage. Lydia had moved out at 22, built a career in real estate, and kept her distance until she needed something. Money, usually, or approval for her choices. The wedding had been the biggest ask yet. $58,000 for a single day by the lake. Eleanor had written the check without hesitation. What else was the money for, if not her daughter's happiness? Molly had never really left. She drifted back after college, then again after a failed job in another city, and then once more with Kyle in tow. "Just until we get on our feet," she'd promised. That was 3 years ago. Kyle still hadn't found steady work. Molly's income came and went like the seasons, and Eleanor paid for everything: the electricity, the heat, the groceries, the repairs. She'd never asked them to leave. They were family. That's what family did. They helped each other. But as Eleanor stared at the phone in her hand, Phoebe's words echoing in her mind, she felt something shift inside her chest. A small crack in the foundation she'd built her life on. Something that should never have been there. What did that mean? An affair? An argument caught on camera? Some embarrassing moment that would humiliate Lydia? Or something worse? Eleanor poured her coffee down the sink. She wouldn't be able to drink it now. Her hands were still shaking, and a cold knot had formed in her stomach. The kind of knot that came before bad news, before funerals, before divorce papers, before everything changed. She heard footsteps upstairs, heavy ones. Kyle. He'd be down soon, expecting breakfast, expecting her to cook for him like she had every morning for 3 years. Molly would follow an hour later, moving slowly, always moving slowly these days. Eleanor didn't want to face them right now. She didn't want to pretend everything was fine. So she grabbed her purse, her keys, and walked out the front door into the cool Minnesota morning. The lake was 3 blocks away. She walked there slowly, her mind racing with possibilities she didn't want to consider. Lydia's wedding had been perfect. Everyone said so. The weather cooperated, the venue was beautiful, the food was excellent. Lydia had looked radiant in her white dress, and Jake had cried during his vows. Had those tears been real? Eleanor reached the shoreline and sat on a weathered bench she'd sat on 1,000 times before. The water was calm today, reflecting the pale morning sky like a mirror. She used to come here with her husband. They'd sit in silence, comfortable in each other's presence, watching the seasons change. She missed that silence now. The comfortable kind. Not the silence of secrets and unspoken resentments. $58,000. She kept coming back to that number. It was more than she'd spent on her own wedding 45 years ago, more than she'd spent on Molly's college education. It was supposed to be an investment in Lydia's future, in her happiness. But happiness couldn't be bought. Eleanor knew that. She'd always known that. So why had she tried? A duck paddled past, leaving ripples in its wake. Eleanor watched those ripples spread outward, growing wider and wider until they disappeared into the vastness of the lake. Come alone. Don't breathe a word to your daughter. Whatever Phoebe had found, it was bad enough to require secrecy. Bad enough to shatter the illusion of that perfect wedding day. And somehow, Eleanor already knew, deep in that place where mothers sense danger to their children, that what she would see at 2 o'clock would change everything. She just didn't know how much. Eleanor sat on that bench until the morning chill seeped through her coat. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked back toward the house where nothing felt safe anymore. 4 hours until the truth. 4 hours until her quiet life would break apart. She would spend those hours cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, and pretending that everything was still all right. But the pretending was getting harder. Eleanor returned home to find Kyle sprawled across her living room sofa, one arm draped over his eyes, the other dangling toward the floor where an empty beer can lay on its side. It was 10:30 in the morning. He didn't move when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence. The television was on, volume low, playing some cooking competition show he clearly wasn't watching. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, still asleep, or pretending to be. Eleanor couldn't tell anymore, and she'd stopped caring which. She set her purse down on the entry table, quietly, always quietly, as if this were his home and she the guest. 3 years of this pattern had trained her into silence. 3 years of tiptoeing around a man who contributed nothing but occupied everything. Kyle Benson was 45 years old. He'd been unemployed for most of the time she'd known him. Molly made excuses, the economy, his bad knee, employers who didn't understand his potential. But Eleanor saw the truth in the way he moved through her house. No urgency, no shame. Just the comfortable sprawl of someone who'd found a place to land and had no intention of leaving. The coffee maker she'd left on earlier had gone cold. She started a fresh pot, listening to the familiar gurgle and hiss, and tried not to look at the dishes piled in the sink. Dishes from last night's dinner that Kyle and Molly had eaten while she was at her book club. They'd promised to clean up. They always promised. Eleanor ran the hot water and began washing by hand. The repetitive motion helped. Soap, scrub, rinse, one plate after another. She'd washed dishes in this sink for 43 years, raised 2 daughters while standing at this exact spot, looking out this exact window at the birch tree her husband had planted the year Lydia was born. The tree was enormous now. Its branches reached toward the house like arms seeking an embrace. Footsteps creaked overhead. Molly's room. A moment later, the bathroom door closed and Eleanor heard the shower start. That would run for 20 minutes at least. Molly took long showers using up the hot water Eleanor paid for, along with everything else. 3 years ago, Molly had appeared at the door with Kyle and 2 suitcases, her face tired and her voice small. She'd lost another job. The apartment lease was ending, They just needed a place to stay while they figured things out. A month, maybe 2. Eleanor had said yes immediately. What kind of mother wouldn't? Molly was her daughter, blood, family. And family helped each other through hard times. But hard times had a way of stretching out indefinitely when someone else was paying the bills. Kyle shifted on the sofa, his hand reaching down to scratch his stomach beneath his t-shirt. Still not awake, still not looking for work, still exactly where he'd been when Eleanor left 2 hours ago, and where he'd likely be 2 hours from now. Eleanor dried the last dish and put it away. The kitchen was clean again, restored to order, though she knew by tonight it would be a mess once more. This was her life now, cleaning up after adults who should have been cleaning up after themselves. She glanced at the clock. 11:15, 2.5 hours until her appointment with Phoebe. 2.5 hours of waiting in a house that no longer felt like hers. Molly emerged from upstairs wearing sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her wet hair pulled into a messy bun. She was 38 years old, but moved with the aimless shuffle of someone much younger. Or much older. Eleanor couldn't decide which. Her daughter smiled when she saw the fresh coffee, poured herself a large mug, and added cream and sugar without asking if there was enough. There was always enough. Eleanor made sure of that. She'd been making sure of things for other people her entire life. Molly settled into the armchair near the window, tucking her feet beneath her, scrolling through her phone with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. The morning sun caught her profile, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the little girl she used to be, bright and curious and full of plans. Where had that girl gone? When had she been replaced by this version? This woman who drifted through days without purpose, without drive, without any apparent need to change. Eleanor wanted to ask, wanted to say something, but the words stayed locked in her throat, the same way they'd been locked there for 3 years. Because what if Molly got defensive? What if she cried? What if she left and never spoke to Eleanor again? The fear of losing her daughters kept Eleanor silent, kept her writing checks, kept her tolerating Kyle's presence in her living room and Molly's endless promises that things would get better soon. Kyle finally stirred, sitting up with a groan that seemed designed to announce his discomfort to everyone within earshot. He ran his hand through his thinning hair, yawned without covering his mouth, and looked around the room as if surprised to find himself there. His eyes landed on Eleanor. No greeting, no acknowledgement of her hospitality. Just a look that said he expected something, though Eleanor couldn't say what. She turned away, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already clean. Behind her, she heard Kyle ask Molly about money. His voice was low, but not low enough. Something about the electric bill. Something about Eleanor probably having extra. Something about how she didn't really need all that money just sitting in the bank anyway. Molly's response was quieter, harder to hear, but the tone was there. Agreement, encouragement, complicity. Eleanor's hands stilled on the counter. The towel hung limp in her grip. She stared at the birch tree outside, its white bark peeling in strips, revealing the darkness underneath. For 40 years, she'd built a business from nothing. Ordered inventory, managed employees, balanced books, dealt with suppliers and customers and inspectors and tax auditors. She'd been strong then, decisive, unafraid. When had she become this person, this quiet woman who cleaned up other people's messes and pretended not to hear conversations about her money? The clock on the microwave showed 11:45. Less than 2 hours now until she'd see whatever Phoebe needed to show her. Whatever truth was hiding in those wedding photos. Eleanor folded the dish towel precisely, hung it on its hook, and walked upstairs to her bedroom. She closed the door behind her, not loudly, but firmly, and sat on the edge of the bed her husband had died in. The house was full of people, but she'd never felt more alone. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought began to form. Quiet at first, barely a whisper, but growing stronger with each passing minute. This can't go on. Lydia arrived at 12:30, just as Eleanor was considering whether to eat lunch or skip it entirely. The doorbell rang twice, Lydia's signature pattern, and Eleanor found herself smoothing her hair before answering, a habit she'd never quite broken around her oldest daughter. Lydia stood on the porch looking like she'd stepped out of a real estate magazine. Tailored navy blazer, cream silk blouse, designer handbag that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in soft waves that looked effortless, but Eleanor knew took considerable time and money to maintain. She smiled when Eleanor opened the door. The kind of smile that showed perfect teeth and reached the eyes but somehow never quite touched the soul. Lydia stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume and the energy of someone who had places to be and schedules to keep. She kissed Eleanor's cheek, a brief press of lips against skin that conveyed obligation more than affection, and immediately glanced around the living room where Kyle still occupied the sofa. Her nose wrinkled slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction that Eleanor caught because she'd spent 42 years learning to read her daughter's expressions. Lydia disapproved of Molly's situation. Always had. She made that clear through small gestures like this. The wrinkled nose, the tight smile, the way she chose seats as far from Kyle as possible. Yet she never offered to help Molly find work. Never suggested Molly move in with her instead. Judgment without solution, criticism without support. That was Lydia's specialty. Eleanor offered tea, and Lydia accepted with the graciousness of someone doing her mother a favor. They settled in the kitchen at the small table where Eleanor had raised 2 daughters and buried 1 husband. Lydia's phone lay face up beside her cup, screen lighting up every few minutes with notifications she glanced at but didn't answer. The conversation started with safe topics. The weather, Lydia's latest real estate sale, a client who'd been difficult but ultimately signed. Lydia spoke with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to filling silence with pleasant noise. Her hands moved as she talked, gestures smooth and confident, everything about her radiating success. Eleanor listened and nodded and poured more tea, waiting. Because Lydia hadn't driven 40 minutes just to discuss the weather. These visits always had a purpose. Always came with a request tucked inside small talk, like a bill hidden in a birthday card. It took 15 minutes for Lydia to get there. The transition was seamless. From discussing her latest sale to mentioning how well the real estate market was doing to talking about houses she and Jake had been viewing. Bigger houses, houses in better neighborhoods, houses with yards and updated kitchens and 3-car garages. Lydia's eyes brightened as she described them. Her voice took on a dreamy quality, as if she were narrating a vision of paradise just within reach. She pulled up photos on her phone, leaning across the table to show Eleanor. Beautiful homes with cathedral ceilings and granite countertops, and master suites larger than Eleanor's entire first floor. Eleanor made appropriate sounds of appreciation, smiled at the right moments, but her stomach was tightening with each new photo, each enthusiastic description. She knew where this was heading, had known from the moment Lydia mentioned Jake's name. The request came wrapped in hesitation. Lydia set down her phone, wrapped both hands around her teacup, and looked at Eleanor with an expression of carefully crafted vulnerability. She bit her lower lip, a gesture Eleanor recognized from childhood, from every time Lydia had wanted something and wasn't sure she'd get it. They'd found their dream house, everything they'd been looking for. Perfect location, perfect size, perfect for starting a family. But the down payment was just slightly out of reach. They were close. So close. Just $40,000 short. Lydia let that number hang in the air between them. $40,000, said casually, as if it were a small thing. As if Eleanor had $40,000 just lying around, waiting for someone to need it. Eleanor's tea had gone cold. She held the cup anyway, needing something to do with her hands. Her mind raced through calculations she'd done 100 times before. The money in her savings. The money she'd already spent on the wedding. The money she'd been quietly using to support Molly and Kyle without asking for repayment. Lydia continued talking, filling Eleanor's silence with reasons why this was actually a good investment. The house would appreciate. Property values in that neighborhood were rising. It would be a smart financial move for everyone. She even suggested Eleanor could visit whenever she wanted, maybe have her own room there for overnight stays. But Eleanor heard what wasn't being said, heard the assumption beneath the request, the unspoken belief that Eleanor's money was somehow family money, that what she'd earned through 40 years of work belonged not just to her but to her daughters, available whenever they decided they needed it. Lydia had never struggled. Even as a child, she'd moved through life with a confidence that came from knowing things would work out. When she wanted something, she found a way to get it, usually through charm, sometimes through manipulation, always through the careful presentation of herself as deserving. And she was looking at Eleanor now with that same expectant confidence, the look that said she'd already decided the answer would be yes. That refusal wasn't even a possibility she'd considered. Eleanor thought about the wedding. $58,000 for one day. She'd written that check without hesitation because Lydia had been happy, or seemed happy, or had performed happiness so convincingly that Eleanor couldn't tell the difference. She thought about Molly upstairs, probably still scrolling through her phone, going nowhere, doing nothing. 3 years of free housing that had cost Eleanor how much? She'd never added it up, didn't want to. She thought about Kyle on her sofa, unemployed and unmotivated, treating her home like a hotel where he'd decided to take up permanent residence. And now Lydia wanted $40,000 more. For a house Eleanor would probably never be invited to visit despite the polite promises. For a life that would continue to need more and more because there was always another house, another goal, another reason why Eleanor's money should become someone else's dream. Lydia was still talking, her voice warm and persuasive, describing the neighborhood, the schools, even though there were no children yet. The commute to Jake's office, the way the morning light would fill the kitchen through east-facing windows. But all Eleanor could hear was Phoebe's voice from this morning, something that should never have been there. She looked at her daughter, polished, perfect, presenting her request like a business proposal designed to make rejection seem unreasonable, and wondered if she'd ever really known her at all. Lydia reached across the table and placed her hand over Eleanor's. The gesture was warm, intimate, calculated. Her perfectly manicured nails contrasted sharply with Eleanor's short, practical ones. Her skin was soft from expensive lotions, while Eleanor's showed the wear of decades of work. Eleanor's throat was tight. She wanted to say yes because that's what she always did. Wanted to be the generous mother, the supportive parent, the woman who put her children's needs above her own. But for the first time in her life, that instinct was competing with something else, something that felt dangerously close to resentment. Lydia squeezed her hand gently, mistaking Eleanor's silence for consideration rather than internal conflict. Her smile widened, victory already visible in her eyes. The clock on the wall showed 1:15, 45 minutes until Eleanor needed to leave for Phoebe's studio. 45 minutes until whatever truth was waiting there would be revealed. Eleanor pulled her hand back slowly, picked up her cold tea, set it down again. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She just sat there, trapped between love and doubt, while her daughter waited for an answer that Eleanor no longer knew how to give. Eleanor arrived at Phoebe's studio 15 minutes early. She'd left the house while Lydia was still waiting for an answer about the $40,000, mumbled something about an appointment, and walked out. The studio sat above a bookstore on Main Street. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs slowly, heart pounding, uncertain whether she actually wanted to reach the top. Phoebe opened the door before Eleanor could knock. Her face was somber, professional, but her eyes held something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Pity, perhaps, or reluctance. The studio was smaller than expected. One large room with white walls covered in framed photographs of weddings and families. Life's happy moments preserved. Phoebe gestured to a chair beside a desk where a large computer monitor glowed. Eleanor sat, hands gripping her purse tightly. She wanted to be anywhere else. Wanted to rewind to this morning before the phone call, before knowing something was wrong. Phoebe's hand hovered over the mouse, hesitating. She glanced at Eleanor with a silent question. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded once. Phoebe clicked. The image filled the screen. Jake Porter stood in an alley behind the restaurant where they'd held the reception. His arms were wrapped around a woman with red hair in a green dress. Not Lydia. They were kissing. Not a friendly peck, but the desperate intensity of people who'd been waiting for this moment. Jake's hand was tangled in her hair. Her arms circled his neck. Eleanor's breath caught. Her vision tunneled while the image remained in sharp, horrible focus. Phoebe clicked through 6 more photos, different angles. In one, Jake's hand rested on the woman's waist. In another, they pulled apart, both smiling. In a third, Jake glanced toward the street, checking if anyone watched. But someone had been watching. The camera had been watching. Phoebe opened a technical window and pointed to specific lines of data. Timestamps, 2:17 in the afternoon. The wedding ceremony had begun at 4:30, 2 hours and 13 minutes before Jake stood at the altar. GPS coordinates verified the location. File properties confirmed these were original, unedited images straight from the camera. Phoebe even showed the raw files still stored on her camera, the full sequence proving these fell between shots of venue decoration and guests arriving. The evidence was irrefutable. Eleanor's hands had gone numb from gripping her purse. She forced them to relax, but they only shook instead. Phoebe explained quietly. She'd noticed the images while editing, spent 2 days deciding what to do. Professional ethics said the client owned all photos. Personal ethics said a mother deserved to know. Eleanor heard the words but couldn't connect them to meaning. Her brain circled one question. Why? Why kiss another woman 2 hours before the wedding? Why go through with the ceremony at all? Why make promises Jake clearly had no intention of keeping? And darker questions beneath, did Lydia know? Was this some arrangement Eleanor couldn't understand? Or was her daughter living a lie? $58,000. The number appeared in her mind like an invoice. She'd spent $58,000 on a wedding for a man kissing someone else in an alley hours before promising fidelity. She thought of Jake's tears during the vows. She'd been touched at the time. But what if those tears had been guilt? She thought of Lydia's radiant smile walking down the aisle. The absolute certainty she was beginning the happiest chapter of her life. Eleanor stood abruptly. The chair scraped. She needed air. Needed to be anywhere but here. She managed to thank Phoebe, heard herself saying something about needing time to think, then found herself back in the staircase, descending too quickly, one hand clutching the railing. Her car was 3 blocks away. She walked there on autopilot, not seeing the shops or people who nodded greetings. She didn't return. Inside the car, Eleanor gripped the steering wheel and stared at nothing. Her mind replayed the images. Jake's hand in red hair, Jake's mouth on someone else's mouth, Jake checking over his shoulder. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the sun to shift, long enough for her hands to stop shaking, though the tremor had moved inward, settling somewhere deeper. Finally, she started the engine and drove home through streets she'd known for 40 years, but which suddenly felt unfamiliar, because now she knew what Lydia didn't. Now she carried a secret that would destroy her daughter's happiness. And Eleanor had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Eleanor pulled her hand back slowly, picked up her cold tea, set it down again. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She just sat there, trapped between love and doubt, while her daughter waited for an answer that Eleanor no longer knew how to give. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table long after the house had gone dark. She hadn't turned on the lights. The darkness felt appropriate somehow. In front of her lay a notebook, calculator, checkbook, and bank statements. 40 years of running a business had taught her to track every dollar. Now those habits were revealing something she wished she didn't have to see. She clicked on the calculator. The small green display glowed as her fingers moved across the keys. Venue rental, $12,000. Catering, $18,000. Photography, $6,000. Flowers, $7,000. Dress, $5,000. Invitations, favors, music, cake, decorations. Each item had seemed reasonable at the time. The calculator showed $58,236. Eleanor stared at that number. More than her first house, more than a new car, more than most people earned in a year. But that wasn't the whole picture. She pulled out another sheet where she'd listed wedding gifts. Lydia had mentioned the total while writing thank you notes. Cash and checks from guests, $40,000. Gifts given directly to Jake during the cocktail hour, $12,000. $52,000 in returns. Eleanor added, then subtracted. The wedding cost, $58,000, but generated $52,000. Net cost, $6,000. And that had been Eleanor's money, not theirs. She sat back, something cold settling in her chest. Lydia's request today, $40,000 for a house. Jake's kiss with another woman, 2 hours before the ceremony. Jake's tears during vows, guilt, not love. Suddenly, Eleanor saw a different picture. One she didn't want to see, but couldn't unsee. What if the wedding hadn't been about love? What if it had been about money? Jake was a salesman. Lydia worked in real estate. Both understood numbers, calculations, opportunities. A wedding that generated $52,000 in gifts. A marriage that would soon extract $40,000 more. A ceremony Jake went through despite being involved with someone else hours before. Why would someone do that? Only one reason made sense. Money. Eleanor felt sick. She stood, paced to the window, tried to push the thought away. Lydia loved Jake. She must. People didn't marry for money anymore, except they did. For security, for houses and lifestyles and appearances. Eleanor knew that. But not Lydia. Not her daughter. Yet the evidence was there. Photos of betrayal. Timing of money requests. The wedding functioning almost like a business investment expecting returns. Eleanor returned to the table and looked at her calculations again. This time as puzzle pieces she was terrified to complete. If Jake was with another woman before the wedding, why proceed? Love didn't make sense anymore. But money did. $52,000 in gifts, $40,000 expected next. A wife with a successful career and a mother-in-law with retirement savings. The cold feeling had spread to her limbs. She felt frozen, trapped with knowledge she didn't want and questions she feared to ask. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly illuminating the room before darkness returned. Somewhere above, Molly and Kyle were probably asleep. Tomorrow, they'd wake expecting Eleanor to have breakfast ready, to pay bills, to continue supporting them because that's what she'd always done. Across town, Lydia was probably planning their future in a new house, bought with Eleanor's money, building a life on a foundation Eleanor no longer trusted. Eleanor closed the notebook, put away the calculator, gathered the statements and receipts. But she couldn't put away what she now understood. Couldn't unsee the pattern the numbers revealed. She sat alone in her dark kitchen and wondered when she'd stopped being a mother and become simply a source of funds. Whether anyone in her family still loved her for anything other than what she could provide. The answer, she suspected, would hurt even more than the question. Eleanor woke the next morning with a headache that felt like her skull was being compressed. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's hand in red hair or the calculator showing $58,000. She made coffee and carried it toward the stairs, thinking she'd retreat to her bedroom. Try to quiet her mind. Pretend her world wasn't collapsing. Halfway up, she heard Molly's voice through the closed bedroom door. Not loud, but clear. Animated. Almost gleeful. Eleanor stopped. She knew she should keep walking. But something in Molly's tone made her pause, frozen on the stairs with coffee growing cold in her hands. Molly was talking to Lydia. Eleanor recognized the rhythm, gaps where someone else spoke. Then Molly's words came through clearly. 2 months. Just 2 months after the wedding, then everything would change. Eleanor's hand tightened on the mug. Her heart beat too fast. Divorce. Lydia and Jake had an agreement, a timeline. 2 months of marriage, then dissolution. But the wedding gifts were already divided, already secured. In a divorce, Lydia would keep her half regardless of what happened to the marriage. Eleanor felt the stairs tilt. She grabbed the railing, forcing herself to stay upright. Molly was still talking, still excited. She mentioned the house Lydia wanted, the $40,000. But Molly had her own ideas about that money. Their mother had that big house, too big for one old woman. Maybe convince her to downsize, sell. And when the house sold, there'd be money to divide. Money for everyone. Molly laughed, light and easy, as if discussing splitting a restaurant bill, not carving up their mother's life while she was still alive. Eleanor backed down the stairs, slowly, quietly, maternal instinct telling her not to make noise even as everything inside screamed. She reached the kitchen and set down the mug, watching her hand shake. This wasn't family helping each other. This was calculation, strategy. Eleanor was an asset to be liquidated, not a person to be loved. And Lydia was at the center. Lydia, who'd married Jake knowing it would end in 2 months. Knowing the wedding was a transaction to generate $50,000 in gifts they'd already divided. The red-haired woman suddenly made sense. The marriage had never been real. It was a performance staged for 200 guests who'd brought checks and cash to what they thought was love. Eleanor gripped the counter. For 3 years, she'd supported Molly and Kyle. For 42 years, she'd loved Lydia. Written checks without hesitation because that's what mothers did. But they didn't see her as a mother. She was a bank account, a resource to extract, a problem to manage until they could access what remained of her life's work. Anger came then, hot and clarifying, burning away confusion and leaving only terrible certainty. She'd been a fool. But she wasn't going to be a fool anymore. Eleanor pulled out her phone and found the business card from her book club. An estate planning attorney who specialized in protecting seniors from financial exploitation. She'd smiled politely when offered the card months ago, thinking she'd never need it. How naive she'd been. She called. A receptionist answered. Could she schedule a consultation? As soon as possible. Urgent, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Eleanor thanked her and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen she'd worked in for 43 years. The house she'd raised 2 daughters in, the life she'd built with her own hands. And she made a decision. No more. No more excuses. No more enabling. No more pretending love justified exploitation. Whatever came next would be painful. Relationships would break. But Eleanor was done being used. Tomorrow she'd talk to the attorney. Tomorrow she'd start protecting what remained of her independence. Upstairs, Molly's laughter echoed once more. Eleanor didn't flinch. She poured her cold coffee down the sink and started fresh. Everything was about to change. The attorney's office was 3 blocks from the lake. Eleanor arrived early and sat in her car gathering courage she didn't know she'd need. Thomas Reed was in his late 50s, with silver hair and a kind face. His handshake was firm but gentle. He led Eleanor to his office, where law books lined the walls and a window overlooked the street. Eleanor began talking. The wedding that cost $58,000. Jake's photos. The overheard conversation about divorce and selling her house. Molly and Kyle living rent-free for 3 years. Lydia's $40,000 request. The systematic transformation from person to resource. Thomas listened, without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When Eleanor finished, her throat was dry and her hands shook. She felt exposed, ashamed somehow. Thomas looked at his notes, then at Eleanor with an expression combining sympathy and directness. Molly and Kyle were unauthorized long-term occupants, not legal tenants. Eleanor could serve a 30-day eviction notice. If they refused to leave, law enforcement could physically remove them. Not pleasant, but legal and enforceable. For asset protection, he recommended an irrevocable trust. Transfer all major assets, house, retirement savings, business proceeds, into a legal structure she couldn't easily undo. She'd remain the beneficiary during her lifetime, with full access to funds. But after death, the trust would distribute according to rules established now, unchangeable by emotional appeals or family pressure. More importantly, the trust sent a clear message. These assets were protected, locked away, no longer available for children to claim or expect. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. This choice would have consequences. Relationships would fracture. Molly would be hurt and angry. Lydia would feel betrayed. Eleanor would be painted as cruel, ungrateful, a bad mother who'd abandoned her children. Some accusations would hurt because part of them would feel true. Good mothers were supposed to sacrifice, put family first, not choose legal protection over bonds. But Thomas had seen this pattern before. Parents draining savings for adult children who never stopped asking, retirements destroyed, homes lost, elderly people left with nothing because they couldn't say no. And often, those same children disappeared when the money ran out. He couldn't make this decision for Eleanor, couldn't tell her whether protecting assets was worth losing relationships with her daughters. But he could tell her what would happen if she did nothing. Molly and Kyle would stay indefinitely. Lydia would keep requesting money. Other schemes would follow, other needs, other situations requiring Eleanor's intervention. Eventually, Eleanor would die exhausted and depleted, having spent her final years as an ATM for people who'd stopped seeing her as human. The office was quiet. Thomas waited, giving Eleanor space to sit with the weight of what she was about to do. She thought about her daughters as little girls, about 40 years of building a business, about her husband who'd believed in hard work and self-respect, about the house she'd earned with her own hands. She thought about Molly's laughter yesterday, plotting to sell that house while Eleanor listened from the stairs, about Lydia's fake marriage designed to extract money from unsuspecting guests, about 3 years of Kyle sprawled on her sofa doing nothing. Eleanor looked at Thomas, and her voice was steady when she spoke. She wanted to proceed with everything. The eviction notice, the irrevocable trust, all of it. Thomas nodded slowly. He'd expected this answer, but still seemed to measure it, making sure Eleanor understood what came next. He pulled out documents, explained each form clearly. The eviction notice would be served by certified mail within 2 days. The trust paperwork would take approximately 2 weeks to finalize. Once signed, these decisions became very difficult to reverse. Eleanor signed where he indicated. Her handwriting was firm, no hesitation. When the paperwork was complete, Thomas stood and shook her hand again. This time, his grip conveyed something different. Respect, perhaps. Or recognition that Eleanor had chosen the harder path, the one requiring courage rather than compliance. Eleanor left the office and walked to her car. The morning sun was warm on her face. Around her, people went about their ordinary days, unaware that she'd just made the most difficult decision of her life. She drove home slowly, hands steady on the wheel. The house came into view, the birch tree, the porch, the windows where her family lived without gratitude or respect. Soon, that would change. In 30 days, Molly and Kyle would be gone. Within weeks, her assets would be locked away where desperate requests and manipulative tears couldn't touch them. Relationships would shatter. Her daughters might never forgive her. She might spend her remaining years alone, cut off from the family she'd sacrificed everything to support. But she'd be free. And she'd be protected. Eleanor parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house she'd fought so hard to keep. Then she got out, locked the car, and walked inside to face whatever came next. The eviction notice arrived by certified mail 2 days later. Eleanor signed for it, climbed the stairs, knocked once on Molly's door, and entered without waiting. Molly was still in bed, though it was nearly 11. Kyle sat on the floor scrolling his phone. They both looked up in surprise. Eleanor rarely entered this room anymore. She handed Molly the envelope without speaking. Molly opened it slowly, pulled out the document, and began reading. Her face went pale, then flushed red. The explosion was immediate. Kyle surged to his feet, the paper crumpled in his fist. His voice filled the room. How could Eleanor do this? Where were they supposed to go? They had nothing, nowhere, no money saved. He moved closer as he shouted, using his height to intimidate. Eleanor had seen this before. Kyle became large when threatened, using physical presence to make others back down. But Eleanor didn't move. She stood in the doorway, arms at her sides, face neutral. Thomas had warned her it would be ugly. Molly started crying, loud, gasping sobs designed to wound. She looked at Eleanor with such betrayal that for a moment Eleanor's resolve wavered. This was still her daughter. But that little girl was gone. This was a 38-year-old woman who'd been using her mother for 3 years without shame. Molly's tears turned to accusations. How could Eleanor abandon family? Reminders of everything Molly had supposedly done for her over the years, though those examples seemed vague and distant. Kyle tried a different approach. His voice dropped, became reasonable. They just needed more time. A few more months. He had job interviews coming. Things were about to turn around. Eleanor recognized the pattern. 3 years of the same promises. Interviews that never materialized. Jobs always just around the corner. She turned and walked downstairs without responding. Behind her, Kyle's voice rose again. Molly's sobs grew louder. Eleanor kept walking until she reached the kitchen and closed the door. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the counter and breathed slowly. This was day 1. 29 more to go. That afternoon, Lydia arrived. Her car pulled into the driveway fast. She used her key and walked straight to the kitchen where Eleanor was washing dishes. Lydia's face was carefully composed, but her eyes were hard. She started with concern. Questions about whether Eleanor was feeling all right, whether she'd been under stress, whether she should see a doctor. The implications were clear. Only someone mentally unwell would evict their own daughter. Eleanor dried her hands and turned to face Lydia. Didn't sit. Didn't offer tea. Just waited. Lydia shifted to pragmatic problem-solving. This house was too much for Eleanor to manage. Too big, too expensive, too much maintenance for someone her age. Wouldn't it make sense to sell? Move somewhere smaller, easier, more appropriate? The suggestion was packaged as care. But Eleanor heard what lay beneath. Sell the house, liquidate the asset, distribute the proceeds. Lydia continued, warming to her pitch. She'd already looked at condos that would be perfect, less upkeep, closer to amenities, and selling would free up substantial capital. Money Eleanor could use for retirement, money that could help her daughters. Jake appeared in the doorway. Eleanor hadn't heard him enter. His voice was smooth, agreeing with Lydia, adding observations about the burden of home ownership. Eleanor looked at him and saw the man from the photographs, the man who'd kissed someone else 2 hours before his wedding, the man who'd helped orchestrate a $52,000 extraction disguised as love. She felt nothing looking at him now, just cold recognition. Lydia was still talking, frustration creeping in when Eleanor didn't agree. She mentioned the down payment she'd requested. Perhaps now wasn't the right time. Perhaps Eleanor needed to focus on her own situation first. The implication was clear. Cooperate about the house, and Lydia would stop asking for money. For now. Eleanor walked to the table and sat. Not from tiredness, but because she wanted them to see her face clearly when she spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. She wasn't selling the house. She wasn't moving. She wasn't interested in their concern or advice. The eviction notice was legal and final. Molly and Kyle had 30 days. The kitchen went silent. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed. Jake's smile faltered. They'd expected Eleanor to bend. Lydia recovered first, her voice sharpened. Did Eleanor understand what she was doing? How this would look? How people would judge a mother who threw her own daughter into the street? Eleanor absorbed the words without flinching. Then she stood and walked to the door, holding it open. Lydia stared at her mother as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps she was. Perhaps Eleanor had been a stranger to herself until now, playing a role she'd thought was required. But that role had been a trap, and Eleanor was done performing. Lydia grabbed her handbag. Jake followed. At the threshold, Lydia turned back once more, her expression cold now. Eleanor closed the door before Lydia could speak, turned the lock with a decisive click. Through the window, she watched them sit in their car talking for several minutes. Then they drove away. Upstairs, she could hear Molly and Kyle moving around, voices raised in agitated conversation. Eleanor returned to the kitchen and finished washing dishes. The routine was soothing. 29 days remained. 29 days of battles and accusations. But Eleanor had drawn her line, and she wouldn't cross back. The invitation came on day 7. Lydia called while Eleanor was making breakfast, her voice carefully neutral. She wanted dinner, all of them together. Talk things through like a family. Eleanor agreed. She'd been waiting for this. Lydia arrived at 6 with Jake and expensive takeout. She unpacked containers, arranging them on the dining table like this was her house. Molly and Kyle came downstairs, summoned by food they hadn't paid for. The 5 of them sat around the table Eleanor had used for 43 years. The same table where she'd fed her daughters as children. Now it felt like enemy territory. Lydia served food with performative care, making sure Eleanor had enough. The subtext was clear. See how well we take care of you? Kyle ate with single-minded focus. Molly picked at her plate, red-eyed from a week of crying. Jake watched Eleanor with careful eyes. Lydia waited until everyone had eaten before beginning. Her voice was warm, reasonable. She understood Eleanor was stressed. The house was a lot to manage. Molly and Kyle's presence had become overwhelming, valid concerns. But eviction seemed extreme. Family didn't treat each other this way. Maybe they could compromise. Molly and Kyle could pay rent. A more reasonable timeline, 6 months instead of 30 days, something that didn't fracture the family. Eleanor listened without speaking. Let Lydia present her entire argument. Watched the others nod, faces hopeful. When Lydia finished, silence settled. She looked at Eleanor expectantly, waiting for negotiation. Instead, Eleanor stood, walked to the kitchen, returned with a manila envelope she'd hidden in a drawer. She placed it on the table between takeout containers and used plates. The mood shifted immediately. Something in Eleanor's expression made them all go still. Eleanor opened the envelope and removed the first photograph, slid it across the table toward Lydia, Jake, and the red-haired woman. The kiss, the alley, 2 hours before the wedding. Lydia's face went white. Her hands shook as she picked up the photo. Jake's expression froze. The charm evaporated, replaced by panic. Eleanor slid over more photos, 6 images total, each documenting the same scene, each proving Jake had been with someone else hours before promising forever. No one spoke. Only Molly's sharp breath broke the silence. Eleanor pulled out her phone and pressed play. Molly's voice filled the dining room, bright and excited, discussing divorce timelines and wedding gift divisions, talking about convincing their mother to sell the house, planning how to split the proceeds. The recording played for 2 minutes. 2 minutes of her daughters treating Eleanor's life savings like an inheritance they'd already earned. When it ended, the silence was absolute. Molly's face went crimson. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Kyle pushed back from the table, chair scraping loudly. Eleanor's voice stopped him. Quiet, but carrying weight. She explained what she'd learned. The fake marriage designed to generate gift money. The planned divorce. The systematic way her family had transformed her into a resource rather than a person. She explained what she'd done in response. The irrevocable trust protecting her assets. The eviction notice that was legal and final. The attorney who'd helped her understand that love didn't require exploitation. Her voice never rose, never shook. She stated facts like she'd once stated business terms. Clear, direct, unemotional. Lydia finally found her voice. Defensive, sharp. Those photos didn't mean what Eleanor thought. There was an explanation. The recording was out of context, misunderstood. But her denials rang hollow. desperate. Jake tried to help, charm returning. The woman was an ex-girlfriend who'd showed up unexpectedly. He'd been saying goodbye. Final closure. Yes, the timing looked bad, but it wasn't what Eleanor assumed. Eleanor looked at him and saw only transparent manipulation. She didn't argue. Just let his words fall into empty space. Molly started crying. Real tears this time, not strategic ones. She reached for Eleanor's hand across the table, but Eleanor pulled back. Kyle stood fully now, face red with anger. He pointed at Eleanor, and his voice was loud, accusatory. She was destroying this family over money, being cruel and selfish. They'd done nothing but try to help her, and this was how she repaid them. Eleanor stood too. Her voice cut through his. The trust was finalized. The eviction stood. In 23 days, Molly and Kyle would be removed by law enforcement if necessary. Her assets were protected. Her house was hers, and none of them would manipulate her again. Lydia slammed her hand on the table. Plates jumped. Her composure shattered completely. She called Eleanor ungrateful, accused her of being a bitter old woman who'd rather die alone than help her own children. Said things would have been different if Eleanor's husband were still alive, implying he would have been more generous, more understanding. Eleanor absorbed every word. Let them hit her and bounce off, because beneath the anger, she heard fear. They'd lost access to her money, lost control, and they were panicking. Jake grabbed Lydia's arm, trying to calm her, but she shook him off, turned to Molly for support. But Molly was still crying, useless in this moment. Eleanor gathered the photos and slid them back into the envelope, picked up her phone, stood there holding the evidence of their betrayal while they sat in ruins of their own making. She told them to leave, not just the house, but her life. She was done. Lydia stood so abruptly her chair fell backward. She grabbed her purse, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. Jake followed, no longer trying to charm or explain. At the door, Lydia turned back. Her voice was ice. She said Eleanor would regret this. That family was everything, and Eleanor was throwing it away. That one day Eleanor would be alone and sick and dying, and no one would be there because she'd pushed everyone away. Eleanor held Lydia's gaze without flinching. Then she closed the door, locked it, and listened to their car pull away. Behind her, Molly and Kyle remained at the table. Molly was still crying. Kyle sat frozen, probably calculating his next move. Eleanor walked past them without a word, climbed the stairs to her bedroom, closed that door too. She sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet darkness. The dinner had revealed everything, stripped away every pretense, and in doing so, had freed her. Relationships were broken, maybe beyond repair. But Eleanor had chosen truth over comfortable lies, had chosen self-respect over being used. 23 days remained. She could survive 23 days. Then she stood and walked to the door, holding it open. Lydia stared at her mother as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps she was. Perhaps Eleanor had been a stranger to herself until now, playing a role she'd thought was required. But that role had been a trap, and Eleanor was done performing. Lydia grabbed her handbag. Jake followed. At the threshold, Lydia turned back once more, her expression cold now. Eleanor closed the door before Lydia could speak, turned the lock with a decisive click. Through the window, she watched them sit in their car talking for several minutes. Then they drove away. Upstairs, she could hear Molly and Kyle moving around, voices raised in agitated conversation. Eleanor returned to the kitchen and finished washing dishes. The routine was soothing. 29 days remained. 29 days of battles and accusations. But Eleanor had drawn her line, and she wouldn't cross back. The 2 weeks following the dinner were the longest of Eleanor's life. Not because time moved slowly, but because each day brought new tactics, new manipulations, new desperate attempts to change her mind. Molly began with apologies. She appeared at Eleanor's bedroom door the morning after the disastrous dinner, eyes swollen from crying, voice small and broken. She was sorry, so deeply sorry. She'd made terrible mistakes, said things she didn't mean. Eleanor listened from her bed, coffee cup in hand, and said nothing. Molly continued. The conversation Eleanor had overheard, that wasn't really how Molly felt. She'd been venting to Lydia, exaggerating, saying things she knew were wrong just to process her frustration. People said stupid things when they were stressed. It didn't reflect her true feelings. The apology was polished, probably rehearsed. Molly had always been good at performing remorse when consequences appeared. Eleanor sipped her coffee and waited for the real ask. It came wrapped in vulnerability. Molly admitted she'd let Kyle influence her too much. He'd been the one pushing her to talk about Eleanor's house, to suggest selling. Molly had just gone along because that's what she did. Went along, avoided conflict, let stronger personalities make decisions. The implication was clear. This was Kyle's fault. Molly was just a victim of his manipulation. If Eleanor could forgive Molly, they could fix this together. Eleanor set down her coffee cup and spoke for the first time. Her voice was flat, emotionless. The eviction stood. Molly had 16 days remaining. Molly's face crumpled. Fresh tears came, these ones accompanied by pleading. Where would they go? They had no savings, no plan. Kyle's job search wasn't going well. They'd be homeless, living in their car. Didn't Eleanor care what happened to her own daughter? Eleanor stood and walked to her closet, began selecting clothes for the day. The conversation was over. Molly left the room sobbing. Within an hour, Kyle appeared. His approach was different. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression serious. No tears, no apologies. Instead, he spoke with the gravity of someone delivering difficult but necessary truth. He was concerned about Eleanor's mental state. These past few weeks, she'd been acting erratically, making impulsive decisions that weren't like her, cutting off her own daughter, trusting lawyers over family, seeing conspiracies where there were only misunderstandings. Had Eleanor considered that she might be depressed? Grief could do strange things to people. Her husband had been gone 15 years, but maybe that loss was finally catching up with her. Combined with the stress of aging, living alone in a house too big for one person, it would be understandable if Eleanor's judgment was impaired. He'd done research, talked to people. There were symptoms of late-life depression that Eleanor should be aware of. Paranoia, withdrawal from family, irrational financial decisions. The implication was obvious. Eleanor wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't competent to make these choices. Needed help. His help, Molly's help, to see reason. Eleanor looked at him and recognized the tactic. Undermine her credibility. Make her question her own sanity. If he could convince Eleanor she was mentally unwell, or convince others of that fact, the eviction might be challenged. The trust might be questioned. She pulled out her phone and opened the voice recorder app, held it up so Kyle could see she was recording. Then she spoke clearly, calmly, listing today's date, her full name, her awareness of her surroundings and circumstances. She stated that she was of sound mind, that the eviction was her deliberate choice, that any claims about her mental competence were false and malicious. Kyle's face darkened. He started to speak, but Eleanor walked past him out of the room, left him standing there with whatever speech he'd prepared dying on his lips. That afternoon, Eleanor heard Kyle on the phone in the living room. His voice carried up the stairs, probably intentionally. He was talking to someone about elderly care facilities, asking questions about admission procedures for seniors whose families were concerned about their ability to live independently. The threat was transparent. If Eleanor didn't cooperate, Kyle would try to have her declared incompetent, would push for guardianship or conservatorship, would use the legal system against her the same way she was using it against him. Eleanor called Thomas Reed immediately, explained what Kyle was attempting. Thomas assured her that the trust documents included competency evaluations from 2 independent doctors. Eleanor's mental fitness was legally established. Kyle's threats were empty, but they revealed how desperate he'd become. The next tactic came from Molly again. She appeared at dinner time with news delivered breathlessly, urgently. She was pregnant. Eleanor was setting the table for one when Molly made this announcement, stood in the kitchen doorway with one hand on her stomach, face arranged in an expression of fragile hope. She'd just found out, only a few weeks along, hadn't told Kyle yet, wanted Eleanor to be the first to know. Her mother, who would be a grandmother soon. The timing was convenient, impossibly convenient. Molly had shown no signs of pregnancy, had drunk wine at the disastrous dinner just days ago, had made no mention of trying for a baby in the years she'd lived here. Eleanor looked at her daughter and saw only calculation. A last desperate card played when all others had failed. Invoke the grandchild. Make Eleanor imagine a baby she'd never meet if relationships remained fractured. Eleanor asked when Molly's first doctor's appointment was scheduled. Molly hesitated. Soon. She'd call tomorrow. Everything had happened so fast. Eleanor offered to come to the appointment, to meet the doctor, to see the ultrasound. Molly's face shifted. Maybe that wasn't necessary. Maybe Eleanor was being invasive. This was Molly's pregnancy, Molly's medical information. Eleanor returned to setting her single plate. The pregnancy would disappear within days, she knew. Quietly forgotten, like all the other lies. 14 days remained. Across town, Lydia was pursuing her own strategy. She began texting Eleanor. Short messages at first, asking how Eleanor was doing, mentioning small memories from Eleanor's childhood, a birthday cake Eleanor had baked, a school play Eleanor had attended. The texts were designed to remind Eleanor of shared history, of love that had existed before money complicated everything. When Eleanor didn't respond, Lydia shifted tactics. She mentioned Jake, how upset he was that Eleanor had those photos, how humiliated he felt. She suggested they could all agree to keep that incident private. No reason for anyone else to know. Jake had learned his lesson. The marriage was real now. They were committed. The subtext was clear. Lydia wanted the photos buried, was willing to negotiate for Eleanor's silence. Then came the actual offer. If Eleanor reconsidered the trust, maybe modified it to be revocable instead of irrevocable, Lydia would accept the eviction, would help Molly and Kyle find somewhere else to live, would stop asking for money, for a while. Eleanor deleted the messages without responding. She'd learned something crucial these past 2 weeks. Her family had an inexhaustible supply of tactics. Tears, threats, guilt, manipulation, lies. They'd cycle through every approach, desperately seeking the one that worked. But Eleanor had something they didn't. Clarity. She'd seen the truth, understood what she was to them, and that understanding had given her something more valuable than their approval. It had given her resolve. 12 days remained. Then 10, then 8. The manipulations continued, but Eleanor had stopped listening, stopped engaging, stopped hoping they'd suddenly become the family she'd once believed they were. She'd grieve that loss eventually, mourn the daughters she'd thought she'd raised. But right now, she just needed to survive until the 30 days ended. And she would, because for the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't fighting for them. She was fighting for herself. Day 30 arrived with clear skies and cool air. Eleanor woke at dawn, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table watching the clock. The sheriff's department would arrive at 9 if Molly and Kyle hadn't vacated. It was 7:30. Upstairs, the house was silent, too silent. They'd been defiant until the end, insisting they wouldn't go, that Eleanor couldn't make them. They were about to learn otherwise. At 8:15, sounds of movement began overhead. Footsteps, muffled voices, the scrape of something heavy being dragged. Kyle appeared first, carrying garbage bags stuffed with clothes. His face was set in hard lines, jaw clenched, eyes refusing to meet Eleanor's. He walked past without acknowledgement, out to their old sedan in the driveway. Molly followed with a cardboard box. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd run out of tears or realized they no longer worked. She paused in the kitchen doorway, opened her mouth as if to speak, then continued outside. They made 6 more trips. Garbage bags, boxes, a broken duffel. 3 years of living here, and they had so little to show for it. Eleanor noticed what they were taking: clothes, electronics, personal items, but also things that belonged to her. A throw blanket, towels, a lamp that had been her husband's. They were stealing on their way out. She said nothing. Let them take it. She wanted them gone more than she wanted to protect her possessions. At 8:45, Kyle came back inside one last time. He stood in the kitchen, breathing hard. His eyes finally met Eleanor's, and what she saw there was pure hatred. Not manipulation, not false concern, just raw loathing. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a car pulled into the driveway. An official vehicle. The sheriff had arrived early. Kyle's face went pale. He turned and walked out quickly, almost running. Eleanor went to the door. 2 deputies stood on her porch, professional and courteous. They asked if the occupants were vacating voluntarily or if assistance was needed. Eleanor gestured to where Kyle was shoving the last bag into their overloaded car. Voluntary. They were leaving now. The deputies nodded, but didn't leave. They'd wait to ensure complete departure. Molly emerged one final time. She'd been upstairs longer, probably taking a last look around. Her face was blank now, all emotion buried or exhausted. She walked to the car without glancing back, got in the passenger seat, sat staring straight ahead. The moment stretched. Kyle's hand on the car door. Molly's profile through the window, the deputies standing ready. Eleanor in her doorway watching 3 years of patience finally end. Kyle got in the car, started the engine. It turned over roughly, then settled into an unsteady idle. The car was old and poorly maintained. The sedan backed out slowly. Kyle had to maneuver carefully. They'd packed it so full that visibility was limited. When he straightened onto the street, he sat there idling. One last hesitation, one last chance for Eleanor to change her mind. Eleanor stood motionless. The car pulled away, turned at the corner, disappeared. The deputies confirmed the occupants had vacated and left. Eleanor stood on her porch watching the empty street. A neighbor walked their dog. A delivery truck passed. Ordinary morning activities. She went back inside and closed the door. The house felt different immediately. Not just quieter, but lighter. As if pressure she hadn't fully recognized had suddenly lifted. She climbed the stairs to Molly's room. The door stood open. Inside, the space looked ransacked. Unmade bed, open drawers, trash on the floor, a stain on the carpet, a crack in the window, nail holes in the walls. It would take work to restore this room. But Eleanor didn't mind. The work would be satisfying, an act of reclamation. She opened the window. Fresh breeze swept in, carrying the scent of grass and lake water. Eleanor spent an hour collecting trash, filled 2 garbage bags, stripped the bed, made note of repairs needed. The house was quiet around her, truly quiet. Not tense silence, but peaceful quiet. The quiet of solitude rather than hostile cohabitation. She made lunch and ate at the kitchen table. Didn't rush, didn't watch the clock, just sat in her own kitchen in her own time. Her phone rang. Lydia calling. Eleanor declined. That afternoon, Eleanor walked to the lake, sat on the same bench where she'd sat 31 days ago after Phoebe's call. Then she'd been frightened and confused. Now she understood everything. And while the knowledge was painful, it was also liberating. The water was calm, reflecting drifting clouds. Eleanor watched them and felt something settle inside her. Not happiness. Too much had been broken. But peace. The peace of knowing she'd protected herself, had drawn boundaries, had chosen dignity. She sat until the afternoon grew cool. Then she stood and walked home. Her home. Truly hers now. Empty of parasites and users. Empty of people who'd measured her worth in dollars. Tomorrow she'd start cleaning properly. Next week she'd get repair estimates. Eventually she'd repaint, replace carpet, make that space into something else. But today she'd simply enjoy the silence. Enjoy the victory of surviving 30 days without breaking. Enjoy knowing she'd fought for herself and won. Eleanor walked into her house and locked the door. The click of the deadbolt sounded final, definitive. She was 71 years old. She'd lost her family but reclaimed her life. And standing in the quiet of her own home, Eleanor decided that was enough. 3 weeks after the eviction, Eleanor received confirmation from Thomas Reed. The irrevocable trust was finalized. Every asset, her house, retirement savings, business proceeds, was now legally protected. Irreversible. Eleanor held the papers and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Ownership. Complete ownership of her own life. Lydia had called 6 times in those 3 weeks. Eleanor hadn't answered. The voicemails progressed through predictable stages. Concern, then justification, then ultimatum. The latest message was cold. Lydia needed money for the house down payment. This was Eleanor's last chance to help. Eleanor deleted the message and blocked Lydia's number. Not from anger, but from necessity. The boundary needed to be absolute. Jake had sent a letter with a check for $5,000. He offered to buy the photographs. A gesture of goodwill, he called it. Eleanor could keep the money. All he asked was that she destroy the images. Eleanor tore the check into pieces and dropped them in the trash. She burned the letter in her kitchen sink, watching Jake's handwriting disappear into ash. The photographs stayed in her drawer. She had no plans to use them, but neither would she destroy evidence just because it made people uncomfortable. With Molly and Kyle gone and Lydia blocked, Eleanor's house settled into gentle quiet. Not oppressive silence, but peaceful solitude. She reclaimed spaces. Molly's room was painted cream, new carpet installed. Eleanor turned it into a library with bookshelves she'd always wanted. A comfortable reading chair, a good lamp, a small table for tea. The room became hers. The living room lost Kyle's imprint. Eleanor bought new cushions, rearranged furniture, opened curtains. Light filled the space again. She cooked meals she actually wanted, small portions for one person, some nights cereal for dinner, some nights elaborate meals just for the pleasure of cooking without interruption. The community center welcomed her back enthusiastically. She taught computer skills to seniors, helped organize potlucks, assisted with the community garden. Work that connected her to people who saw her as Eleanor, a competent woman with skills, rather than a source of funds. One woman mentioned ukulele lessons at the local music shop. Eleanor had never played an instrument, always too busy with business, daughters, managing a household full of people who took without giving. But she had time now, abundant time that belonged entirely to her. She signed up for lessons, bought an inexpensive ukulele. The first lesson was awkward, but by the third, she could play 3 chords cleanly. By the 6th, she'd learned her first complete song. Nothing complex, just a simple melody, but it was hers. She practiced in the evenings, sitting in her living room with windows open, the ukulele's sound mixing with birdsong. Her fingers grew calloused. Her timing improved. Phoebe called on a Tuesday. She'd been thinking about Eleanor, wanted to know how things had worked out. Eleanor gave her the abbreviated version, the trust, the eviction, the severed relationships. Phoebe suggested coffee. Nothing heavy, just conversation and maybe a pastry. They met the following week at a cafe downtown. Phoebe shared her own story of family complications and boundary setting. Eleanor contributed her experiences, not dwelling on pain, but acknowledging it. They talked for 2 hours, made plans to meet again. When they parted, Eleanor felt something she'd almost forgotten. Real friendship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Walking to her car, Eleanor passed a small art gallery. On impulse, she went inside. One painting caught her attention, an abstract piece in blues and greens, colors that reminded her of the lake. She bought it, not because anyone else would like it or because it matched her furniture, just because she wanted it. At home, she hung the painting where Kyle used to occupy the sofa. The colors brought life to the wall. Eleanor stood back and looked at her living room. Her furniture, her painting, her ukulele, her quiet house filled with her choices. She was 71 years old. Her daughters might never forgive her. Her family might stay fractured forever. She might spend her remaining years with limited contact from people she'd raised and loved. But she had her house, her savings, her time, her peace, her freedom to make choices without manipulation or guilt. She had coffee dates with friends, music lessons, volunteer work, books to read, mornings to drink coffee slowly without interruption. She had a life that was entirely, completely, unapologetically hers. Eleanor walked to the window and looked at the birch tree her husband had planted 40-some years ago. Its branches swayed in the breeze, strong and enduring despite decades of weather. She'd survived her own storms, the winter of discovering she'd been used, the difficult spring of establishing boundaries. Now it was summer, not the beginning of her life, but a new chapter, one where she got to be the author instead of supporting character in someone else's story. Eleanor smiled, just a small curve of satisfaction and peace. She turned from the window and walked to the kitchen to make dinner. Something simple, something just for her. Outside, the sun moved toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside, Eleanor began to cook, moving through her kitchen with the ease of someone who'd finally come home.